And I'm the Bishop of Great Falls, Billings, Montana, and ostensibly the present chair of the Catholic Common Ground and Mission Advisory Committee. And we have a number of the members here. We've been meeting today, and on behalf of all of us, I thank all of us for coming. This evening promises to be very enriching. We have the two individuals with John Carr and Sister Helen, Prejean. They're both very witty. They're both very smart. They're both very wise, and they're both very holy. And they have to share a lot with us tonight. So again, just thank you for being with us for this evening. It does promise to be a very rich time.
Sister Prejean embodies this mission to lead our church into wisdom and understanding around critical issues such as the death penalty. Her life's work has been an encounter with those our country deems disposable. She has engaged the public in her pursuit for justice, and she has done all this through dialogue. With deep appreciation for her extraordinary contributions to the life of the church and her long-standing and abiding commitment to fostering dialogue around the death penalty, the Catholic Common Ground Initiative is proud to present its 2016 Cardinal Bernardin Award to Sister Helen Prejean, C.S.J., on the 24th day of June in the year of our Lord, 2016.
When we share our faith with each other, it's like we blow on the coals of our souls and we alight in us the Spirit of God who's in us. And that's the beauty of sharing. Bishop, I don't want you to have to stand there with the award. You could sit if you want. But thank you, servant of the servants of God. Oh, yeah, give it back. Thank you. It just didn't feel right to have a bishop standing there holding it. So anyway, what we do is we enkindle the fire that's in our hearts with each other. That's the beauty of community. And that's why we'll always need community and be indebted to community. Especially my own sisters who have been with me in my growing. I want to just share a couple of little stories because I know John Carr, I don't want to take a second away from the wisdom that's going to come from John Carr, who's going to deliver this to us tonight. But a couple of stories of the faith and what God can do in any of us. I'm writing a book now. It's called River of Fire, and it's the spiritual journey that brought me to death row and to the ministry that has come out of that. And I wrote a prelude in the book, and it's about fire, and it goes like this. They killed a man with fire one night. They strapped him in a wooden chair and pumped electricity through his body until he was dead. His killing was a legal act because he had killed. No religious leaders protested the killing that night. But I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And what I saw set my soul on fire, a fire that burns in me still. And now here's an account of how I came to be in the killing chamber that night and the spiritual currents of the gospel that pulled me there. That fire, that awakening is the grace of God. For a long time I wasn't awake to the call of the gospel to do justice in the world. I was a good nun, I was a good teacher, I was prayerful, I was pious, I was charitable to the people around me, but I didn't get it about the radical call to be with those who were suffering and who were alone and who were despised. I'm still grateful for that waking up. And whenever we wake up, it is always grace that wakens us. That waking up then led me, when I came out of the execution chamber that night, the mission just opened up and became clear to me that what had happened in the darkness, right after midnight in Louisiana, behind prison walls, and I knew that the public the next day, I think in Louisiana in 1984, support for the death penalty was probably at 85%, close to 90%. The common thinking of the people was people that do terrible crimes deserve to die, and this is justice, and we're doing it for the victim's family, and all the reasons that we give each other when we do things. And that my mission would be to go and to tell the story, in season, out of season, to awaken the people. And it was in the belief of the goodness of the American people. It was not because people were closed and mean and racist and wanted vengeance. It was out of the goodness of people to go and find a way to awaken them in gentleness and love. And so I began. And God can work in anybody. I'm a proof of that. And the people that know me best in the community just go, wow, well, if God could do it in Helen, God could do it in anybody. I mean, you know, it's just because they know you in the community. They know you in your family. They know you. And so I've been steeped in the grace to be able to do this. I had no idea about the suffering. I simply had no idea what it meant to be sitting in a cell and to have people who hated you so much they were going to kill you, and it was all going to be legal, and everybody was going to say good riddance. It is hidden from our eyes. The suffering of the poor is hidden from our eyes. The sins of racism is hidden from our eyes. And I got to be there. And it was a privileged encounter. And Pope Francis kept calling to us to get out of our buildings, get out of administrating religion, to go to the place of encounter, to be the field hospital where the wounded and the suffering are, to get out to where the suffering people are. And it is the suffering that holds me. I accompany people on death row, and they teach me, they help me, they keep me awake and hold me close to the fire because their suffering is enduring. And they are alone, and they are despised, and treated like disposable human waste. And I've been privileged to be awake enough by God's own grace to be able to accompany them and then to bring their stories out, to awaken in people's hearts the desire for compassion and to be a people of justice. People don't have a clue about all that's wrong with the death penalty. They don't know how racist it is and how it's only when white people are killed that the death penalty is sought. They don't have any idea of the suffering of what goes on, or even what happens to the guards who have to do the killing for us and what happens to them afterwards. They don't know because they're not there. They can't see. It's hidden from our eyes. And so we go as we are called, each of us in our own way. And so on nights like this, I'm being held up, but we could hold up each person here to tell your story of faith and what God is doing in each of us to bring God's kingdom closer. And so I say this to you with great humility and thanksgiving for my community, my religious sisters, my Catholic faith that has nurtured me from my birth until now, and to be in your company of all of you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister. I'm Father Michael Place, priest of the Archdiocese, a member of the Catholic Common Ground Initiative Committee. And so it is my privilege to introduce Mr. John Carr to give this year's Monsignor Philip J. Murnion lecture under the title, Faithful Citizenship in 2016, Is There Common Ground to Pursue the Common Good? John Carr.
I want to thank Michael for that exceedingly gracious invitation. I really feel Phil and Cardinal Bernardin's presence tonight. But I want to begin by setting something straight. Tonight you heard a bishop say something that wasn't true. Bishop Werfel, in introducing me, said I was smart and wise. No one who is smart or wise would agree to talk about faithful citizenship in 2016. The truth is, when Michael called me with this invitation, before a single vote had been cast, I thought, how hard could this be? You know, it's going to be a Back to the Future election. You know, Clinton versus Bush probably. What could be so tough about that? And then he said, and we're giving the award to Sister Helen. And I said, I love Sister Helen. Never did it occur to me that I'd be in a setting where Sister Helen would talk for 10 minutes and I'd talk for 50, and everybody would be saying, why is he doing all the talking? So in that holy part, takes some work, but not wise, not smart, but honored to be here. Phil was a mentor who became a friend. He was a leader who advanced all the things I cared about in the church. He's a great priest, great leader. I still, when something happens, catch myself saying, you know, I ought to call Phil and see what he thinks. Sister Helen is a hero who became a friend. She is, sometimes people say, can we make a difference? Sister Helen is a leader in one movement in the Catholic community and broader that has made enormous progress. Capital punishment used to be an untouchable issue, and now states are abandoning it. Juries are not imposing it. Prosecutors are not asking for it. Judges are not giving it, and Catholics in particular are deciding that it is inconsistent with who we are and what we believe. And lots of people have helped bring that about, but one woman has been our leader, and that's Sister Helen. There are two things about her that I love. One is, from the very beginning, she reached out not only to the despised on death row, but to the victims and their families who had been abandoned. How Catholic is that? And secondly, Phil's sidekick was Harry Fagan. Some of you know Harry. And one of Harry's great lines is, there's nothing worse than a grim do-gooder. Sister is the antithesis of the grim do-gooder. There's nobody more fun than Sister Helen. And to be at the periphery, she is the joy of the gospel at work. And so I'm honored to be here on the night that she is honored. And I'm happy to be back a part of the Common Ground Initiative. As Phil said, I was sort of a quiet partner and honored to be in the room. And, but I have not been a part of this. And I'm really pleased to be a part of it now and to see the good work that has been done. It needed more than ever in our country and our church. But as I said, I looked at who had given this lecture. The bishop had given it. Sister Katerina had given it. Cardinal Hume. Cardinal Dulles. My first thought was, what happened to standards? And then I thought, you know, I haven't been particularly, I feel a little bit like the outsider at an important parish event who was asked to preach. And he prepared well, thought he had given a good homily. And as was the custom, he and the pastor stood in the back of the church when Mass was over and greeted people. And most folks were very kind, very complimentary. But at the very end of the line, a guy came up, reached out his hand, and said, "You talk way too fast. You really had very little to say, and it wasn't very helpful." Well, obviously this concerned the preacher, and he turned to the pastor and said, "Who is this guy, and what is his problem?" And the pastor, not having heard this, said, "Oh, don't worry about him. He just goes around repeating what everybody else is saying." Well, I've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to talk pretty fast. I hope it might be helpful. But I'm not going to stand in the back with Bishop Werfel when this is over. Despite my outsider status, I do bring some perspectives. Michael graciously mentioned 25 years at the Bishops' Conference. Two things about that. One, it was a wonderful job. I saw the strength and vitality of our church's mission, not only in this country, but around the world, including especially here in Chicago. It's a great place to see people standing up for human life and dignity in a way that made you proud. It was not always easy. I was there in the worst of the sex abuse crisis. I had teenage boys at the time. I remember saying to one of the bishops, when limbo went into limbo, I said, "I never really understood limbo. I never knew what exactly happened to those babies. And I don't feel bad about its demise. But do not mess with purgatory, because working for you has to count." But it had its advantages. I had the most pompous title in Washington. How would you like to be Executive Director of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops? Some of you have heard me tell this story over and over again. I was on an elevator introduced by this pompous title. This gentleman says, "He's in charge of justice, peace, and human development." And she looked at me and said, "You need to do a better job." And we do need to do a better job of building up the common ground for the common good. My work at Georgetown has been terrific. There is a hunger for what brings us together tonight. We've had about a dozen major forums, 8,000 students, faculty, leaders, ordinary people in Washington. We're reaching out to young people who work at the White House or on the Hill or in Washington. They want the moral vocabulary Catholic social thought offers. They are not only intrigued, but incited by this Pope. One of them said to me, "We have a Pope who knows how to pope." And that's good. We have brought people together to work across party lines, ideological lines, around important issues. We brought the President of the United States and conservative leaders together to dialogue on poverty. I'm going to talk about politics tonight. I ought to declare where I stand. I am a product of a mixed marriage. Both my parents are Catholics from Minnesota. My mother is from St. Paul and my dad from Minneapolis. This is a bigger deal than you know. It's sort of like the South Side and the North Side, the Cubs and Sox. For purposes of this conversation, my mother and her family absolutely committed Republicans. My uncle was the Republican leader of the Minnesota Senate. My dad's family, diehard Democrats. My grandfather was Hubert Humphrey's finance chairman when he ran for mayor. For many of you in the room, Hubert Humphrey was a vice president of the United States and a Democrat. Some of us remember all too well. So I learned at an early age that we can express our faith and act on our values in different ways. So I'm honored to be here by the people we remember, Phil and Cardinal Bernardin, by the wonderful leader we honor, and also by the task in front of us. How do we build up the common ground for the common good? I want to ask the question, is there common ground for the common good? And specifically, does Cardinal Bernardin's consistent life ethic provide us a way to build up the common ground? Let me begin with my razzle-dazzle. Look at that. 2 pictures. One, 55 years old. John Kennedy before the Houston Ministerial Association. Some of you are too young to know this, but in 1960, big shots, Billy Graham, Norman Vincent Peale, Martin Luther King Sr. said John Kennedy should not be president of the United States because he would take advice from the Pope. The second picture, 9 months ago, you recognize the guy in white. The 2 guys behind him, Catholic kids from Pennsylvania and Ohio. Remember what they said to John Kennedy. And the only thing their 2 parties could agree on was they needed advice from the Pope. We have come a long way. And we talk about this in a city that has made enormous contributions to that task. By some accounts, John Kennedy would not have been president without the votes from the cemeteries of Chicago. Mo Udall ran for president, wonderful Washington leader. He was dying of a debilitating disease, and someone said, "Any last wish?" And he said, "I would like to be buried in Chicago because I want to remain politically active." But it is not only in politics that Chicago has led. It is in our church. Chicago has been a vibrant source of leadership, direction, vision for as long as this local church has been alive. And you have had 3 pastors, each in their own way, each remarkable leaders, who have focused on our challenge tonight. Cardinal Bernardin came up with this formulation, which frankly changed my life. A consistent ethic of life provides a standard to test public policy, party platforms, and candidates. It cuts across the conventional party lines. It will not lead to crystal clear judgments on candidates, but it may give the church, an institution, and community a better way to engage at the intersection between moral vision and public policy and political choices. That is still the case. Your new Archbishop, a friend of mine since college. We actually went to school together. Now, he was smart and wise and holy. He extends this. The church is calling for a consistent ethic of solidarity, making sure no one, from the first moment of life to natural death, from the wealthiest to the poorest neighborhoods, is excluded from the table of life. We must resist what Pope Francis calls the throwaway culture that treats people as things and is tempted to discard the weak and the vulnerable, those without money or power or voice. Cardinal George, president of our conference, I had the pleasure to serve him. He had a unique way of boiling things down to the essence. And the quote I'm about to show probably does not do justice to the sophisticated reasoning and theological expression that he normally used. This was to the City Club of Chicago in front of the political leaders of the city. One can say that the Democratic Party has lost its soul. One could also argue that the Republican Party never had a soul. Cardinal George had a way of endearing himself to people. But there's some evidence that it could be true. Think about our choice this year. I do not believe, I'm going to make this clear, that church officials, pastors, bishops ought to tell you how to vote. I'm not going to. But is the candidate honest and trustworthy? Trump, 64% no. Hillary Clinton, 64% no. New York Times, CBS poll a month ago. Favorable rating for Hillary Clinton, unfavorable 55. Donald Trump, unfavorable 60. Whatever you think, and you may be an enthusiastic supporter of one of these, but most of us are not, frankly. In fact, one person expressed this in the most vivid way possible in her obituary. This is a direct quote from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Faced with the prospect of voting for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, Mary Noland of Richmond chose instead to pass into the eternal love of God on Sunday, May 15th. She said this was the one good thing about dying. And her husband reflected it. It's a little strong. I have had that feeling on occasion, and we are in a difficult place. The common ground is all too narrow. The consistent life ethic is honored in the breach. So what brings us together? We're not the Democratic Party of Prayer. We're not the Catholic caucus of the Republican Party. We're not here tonight to make America great again or to break the barrier and have the first female president. You're leaders of a community of faith, not an interest group. We draw our strength and direction not from a particular campaign or ideology, but from the Word of God and the teaching of His church. I remember working for the Bishops' Conference, and we had a wonderful statement on some important topic, and a bishop raised his hand, and he said, "This is really wonderful. It expresses our teaching very well. Do you think we could mention Jesus just once?" So I think it's really important to go back to the source. I've read the mission statement of the Catholic Common Ground Initiative. It's well done, it's powerful, it's needed. This is the best mission statement I've ever seen, ever read. Jesus in his hometown synagogue says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, new sight to the blind, and to set the downtrodden free." Why did Jesus come? He came to bring life and bring it to the full. His words. What does it mean to bring good news to the poor in a rich country where a fifth of our children are growing up poor, with such incredible gaps between rich and poor? How do we bring liberty to captives in a society where people are imprisoned by racism, discrimination, lack of opportunity, an unjust criminal justice system? And what does it mean to bring life and life to the full in a city where 300 people have already been shot dead this year? I read one person gunned down in a drive-by shooting in front of one of our parishes during Mass. How do we bring life and bring it to the full? And the Lord described our vocation in vivid terms. You are the salt of the earth. But if it loses its flavor, how can it be made salty? It's good for nothing. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. So don't put it under a bowl. Put it on a stand. Let your light shine before others. How, in the most powerful democracy on earth, in the middle of a surprising, angry, perhaps close election, how are we called to be light, salt, and leaven? Our church has been thinking about this a long time, and it sort of set the boundaries for us. The Second Vatican Council, the document on Gaudium et Spes, says the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of all of this age, especially those who are poor, are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Pope Benedict, I think, gave the best definition of the church's responsibility in public life. He said, "It is not our responsibility to make our teaching prevail. Rather, we are called to form consciences and to stimulate greater insight into the requirements of justice, as well as greater readiness to act, even when this might involve conflict with situations of personal interest." In English, we're not to impose our vision on society. Rather, we're to form the consciences of citizens, of us, so we might understand more clearly the demands of justice, and we might act differently, even if this involves a conflict with our own interests. Pope Francis picks this up. He really taps into the cynicism and skepticism of our age. He says, "None of us can say I have nothing to do with politics. No, I am responsible." And he quotes the social doctrine of the church saying that politics is one of the highest forms of charity because it serves the common good. In many ways, the most countercultural thing the church teaches is not that all life is sacred. It's not that the poor ought to come first. It's not that war ought to be a last resort. It is that politics is a good thing. Pope Francis quoted this statement of the U.S. Catholic bishops in The Joy of the Gospel. In Catholic teaching, responsible citizenship is a virtue, and participation in the political process is a moral obligation. We cannot sit on the sidelines wringing our hands, complaining about others. When I talk about this, I hear my grandmother saying, "We don't discuss religion and politics." And so to reassure my grandmother, and maybe some of you, I like to talk about what faithful citizenship is not. It is not about the religious practices of politicians. It's not about whether they sing in the choir. It's not about whether they're born again. It's not about whether Donald Trump knows 2 Corinthians or not, has ever asked for forgiveness, although I have a little question about that. It's not whether Hillary Clinton is a Methodist, which he is, or that Barack Obama is a Christian, which he is. It is not the faith they profess. It is the principles they stand for. Let me go back. It is not about the political clout of religious groups, at least for us. Maybe you can talk about the black church vote or the evangelical vote. But I figure people who talk about the Catholic vote don't know many Catholics. They certainly don't know my family. As our bishops say, we understand that politics can be a mess. But we're for a different kind of political engagement that is shaped by moral convictions and well-formed consciences, that is focused not on our own interests, not on money, not on power for its own sake, but on the dignity of every human being, pursuit of the common good, and protection of the weak and vulnerable. That really sounds like the debates we've heard, right? What a mess. So we have this mission, a different kind of politics. What are the assets we bring? Well, we don't bring the traditional ones. We don't make campaign contributions. We don't have a PAC. We don't make endorsements. We've never flown anyone to Scotland to play a round of golf. So we don't play the game the way most people do. Instead, we have a different set of assets, and those assets begin with a different way of looking at the world. A moral framework, a set of principles we call Catholic social teaching. And I argue that the most important word in all those encyclicals, in all those documents, is and, A-N-D. Think about it. Human life and dignity. When our culture, when our politics tries to pull those two things apart. Human rights and responsibilities. On Capitol Hill, you have some people talk about rights, other people who talk about responsibilities. Family and community. Some people talk only about family. Other people talk only about broader social responsibility. We talk about both. The priority for the poor and the vulnerable. The dignity of work, yes, and therefore the rights of workers to a living wage, to have a voice in the workplace. Solidarity, we're one human family, and subsidiarity, how do we divide up the work? Care for the planet and care for the poorest people on planet. One of the most powerful things about Laudato Si, I think, is Pope Francis placed care for creation in the middle of Catholic life. And he put a priority for the poor in the middle of an environmental ethic. And he challenged both of us. So we have a different way of looking at the world. It doesn't fit the categories of right and left, Democrat or Republican. With all due respect to our evangelical sisters and brothers, this is a lot more complicated than what would Jesus do. But it's not only what we believe, it's what we do. Think about Chicago. Think about our country. Who feeds the hungry? Who shelters the homeless? Who welcomes immigrants? Who educates young people in this city? Who accompanies people on death row? We're the largest non-governmental provider of education, healthcare, and human services. So it's not just what we do, not just what we say, it's what we do. And we have institutions. We organize ourselves to carry out these works of mercy. What, Michael? 18,000 parishes? 18,000 in the country? Yeah. 700 hospitals? Yeah, that's pretty good for me. I got within 100. I'm not going to ask you about schools. Thousands of schools. We're in every congressional district. We're in rural communities. We're in the inner city. We cross lines of race, ethnicity, income. And we have leaders. And I would suggest we've been blessed with a whole series of effective leaders. I am not one that says, JP2 was this, Benedict was that, now we got Francis. I think we have a very strong tradition of consistent teaching expressed by different leaders in different ways. But this is a remarkable moment. From the very beginning, he set his priorities. Bishop, I think it's a mortal sin to talk about what happens in a conclave. I read that. And so what did Pope Francis do? As soon as he's elected, he calls a press conference to tell them what happened in the conclave. And these are his words. He said, when it was getting dangerous, when the votes were rising, my friend leaned over, hugged me, kissed me, and said, don't forget about the poor. He said, that's when I decided I'll be Francis, man of the poor, man of peace, a man of creation, from the very beginning. And then there were so many moments. First thing he did, he went to Lampedusa, the Isle of Tears. You can imagine, they're at breakfast. New Pope, new staff. Pope reads that a boat went down, turns to his new person. He says, we ought to go to Lampedusa. And the Monsignor says, oh, Holy Father, 2016, 2017. He says, how about Thursday? And then he said, who cries for these mothers, these people? But for me, probably for you, very powerful for him to come to the United States. We think we're the center of the world. He had never set foot here. We weren't the center of his world. But he came as an outsider, but also as a neighbor. And what an amazing show of respect. I had the great honor to be in the Congress when he spoke. And he was straining to be heard in English, and we were straining to hear him. And then I was just stunned to hear him talk about our faith through the lives of 4 Americans. Our nation can be considered great when it defends liberty as Lincoln did, when it fosters a dream of full rights as Martin Luther King did, when it strives for justice as Dorothy Day did, and when it sows peace as Thomas Merton tried to do. What an amazing tribute to our faith in this country. And then, far more powerful than the words, for me, were what he did. He was with the most powerful people in Washington. They had invited him to lunch. And he said, no, I'm going to be with the least powerful people. He was with the hungry and the homeless and the left behind in Washington. And guess what? He seemed to be a lot more comfortable there. So what is Pope Francis' message? He looks at everything from the bottom up. The church, politics, economics, environment. What's he telling us to do? Look at politics. Look at our choices from the bottom up. He looks at institutions from the outside in, from the peripheries to the center. Washington is not the peripheries. Washington is preoccupied with itself. He says we ought to begin with the least among us and then worry about the rest of us, and only then worry about the people with the most. He said early on we should not be obsessed with certain particular issues. In this case, abortion or birth control. But he hasn't retreated from those. One of the most powerful lines he said, it is not progressive to destroy a life to solve a problem. So he has stood up for the unborn. He has stood up for the family. But he has done so within a larger context. Context like Cardinal Bernardin's consistent ethical life, a metaphor he calls the throwaway society. And he has become a walking, talking parable of the love of Christ, of the mercy of God, and the joy of the gospel. So he is in many ways an extension of that teaching. Bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives. I come to bring life. But he brings new urgency, new priorities, and a new authenticity. It's his strong words, but it's also his humble ways. We have had a number of sessions at Georgetown about our Holy Father and his message. And I remember two things. I think it was Kim Daniels who said, we asked, why are people paying attention? And she said, he walks and talks like Jesus. Michael Gerson said, I'm an evangelical. He's not my pope. But I think your pope is a troublemaker. And he said, there's nothing more dangerous than a troublemaker with a plan. And I asked Ross Douthat, a more conservative voice, and I said, is the pope a troublemaker? And he said, of course he is. He's a Christian. So we have a Christian who's a troublemaker who looks at the world from the bottom up. And he makes a point of saying that the responsibility to renew the earth, to stand up for our values, is with the laity. We shouldn't clericalize the laity, he says. I was a Eucharistic minister, it's wonderful. But it's not my core vocation. We are called to be a leaven of the love of God in society, so we must enter public life with the values of our faith before us, with a mature conscience and competence to realize them. When we talk about Catholics being the leaven of the love of God, the responsibility to participate, well, the first thing we have to say is not enough of us participate. Lots of people aren't registered, lots of people don't vote, lots of people aren't informed. A lot of us vote our party, our class, our interests, our prejudices, more than our faith. And everything we've studied says that Catholics are open to the moral dimensions of issues, but they don't want to be told who to vote for. Catholics are crucial. In 10 of the last 11 elections, presidential elections, Catholics voted for the winning candidate. We're diverse, racially, ethnically, economically, but we're not monolithic. These logos came from the last election. Apparently someone had the same designer. One way to think about Catholics is 40%, like my dad, tip towards the Democratic side, 40% like my mom, tip towards the Republican side, and 20% of us decide who's president. The biggest difference is not ideology, it's ethnicity. White Catholics tend towards more conservative Republican orientation, Latino Catholics more democratic and progressive. This is an outdated slide, but I couldn't find one more. It gives you a sense of who we are. A quarter of us are white conservatives, about a third of us white moderates, 10% white liberals, 21% Latinos, and then we have a vibrant African American, Asian community as well. This is to demonstrate my point that Catholics vote for the winner and that Anglo-Catholics and Latino Catholics tend to point in different directions. The other thing the experts would tell you is how often you go to Mass reflects often who you vote for. One of the most remarkable things, this is a parentheses, and I think this is a tribute to Sister Helen and Pope John Paul II and the Catholic bishops. When we studied the data on the death penalty, the Catholics who were most likely to change their mind were the Catholics who went to church the most often, who went to Catholic schools, who went to Catholic universities, who heard the message. This is one of the things you ought to know is while Catholics are really important, nobody seems very interested. The pollsters, the media, don't focus on Catholics. We've had endless stories about evangelicals and their problems or not problems with Trump. Almost no coverage of Catholics. This is the Reuters poll that shows essentially Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump tied at this point. There are lots of groups within our community that are trying to influence our votes. A revolution of tenderness, I don't think they're supporting Trump. That's just a guess. The Voter's Guide for Serious Catholics, they're the non-negotiables people. In Faithful Citizenship, the bishops warn against relying on these things. They tend to more reflect the biases of the people who put them out than the faith. I think I'm going to skip the PowerPoint from here on out, both for reasons of time and coherence and because I have no eyes in the back of my head. For many years, E.J. Diona and I have had an argument that which institution is in more trouble, Catholic Church or American politics? And for many years, he was kicking my butt. I mean, we had scandals, we had impact. I said to E.J. at one of our events, Sister was there, I think, I said, E.J., how does it feel that Washington is the place of paralysis and stalemate, and the Catholic Church is the place for hope and change? He was not pleased. Politically, the answer to the question, is there common ground for the common good? The answer is no. Think about the Congress this week. 5 bills. Whatever you think about the Second Amendment, whatever you think about the right proposals, we could not agree. The Senate could not agree on one of 5 proposals on how to keep guns out of the hands of people on the terror list. The House was reduced to, a sidewalk protest because they couldn't even get a vote. In many ways, Washington is demoralized. They can't get anything done, and they've lost their way. The test of our society is how we care for the weakest. They're focused on the rich and the powerful. And I think both parties have sort of left us. Our alliances are broken. Remember the Republicans? George W. Herbert Walker Bush said, a kinder, gentler nation. I was an admirer of George W. Bush's compassionate conservatism, especially what it did in Africa. Well, now the nominee of the Republican Party, well, I won't use my language. This is what some conservatives have said. First of all, this is Trump in his own words. On torture, I'd do a lot more than waterboarding. We ought to kill the families of terrorists. Anyone who kills a police officer, the death penalty is going to happen. Mexico is sending rapists, murderers. I don't know anything about David Duke or those white supremacists. If there was something wrong, I'd condemn it. So this is Michael Gerson talking about the evangelical meeting this week. He says it might be a case for Trump. He thinks it's a weak one, but it's a torture case, not a celebratory case. He described one evangelical says, here's the deal. You get racism, misogyny, torture, and an authoritarian commander-in-chief, but you get to hear Merry Christmas in stores. That's the art of the deal. So he says, we're cozying up to a leader who has placed bigotry and malice at the center of American politics. Genuine social influence will not come by putting Christ back into Christmas. It will come by putting Christ and his priorities back into Christians. This is a group of conservative leaders, Robbie George, George Weigel, others, manifestly unfit, vulgarity, appeal to fear, terrorism. We don't know whether he shares our commitments to the right to life, to religious freedom, and rights of conscience. There has been a hostile takeover of the Republican Party that frankly doesn't leave much room for my mother's Republican Party. It used to be Republicans pro-labor, pro-immigrant. Paul Ryan, I think, is an impressive leader. You may disagree with him, I disagree with him, but he has challenged Trump on immigration, on the Muslim ban, on racism, and he's working on poverty. Among the Democrats, there are two things that bother me, and this is personal, and we can talk about it. They seem to spend a lot of their energy on things I don't agree with them on, and too little of their energy on what I expect them to lead on. Remember when Democrats told us, don't be single issue? Remember when Democrats, Hillary Clinton, said abortion ought to be safe, legal, and rare? She doesn't say rare anymore. The consensus in America was that abortion was going to be legal in limited circumstances, and no one was going to be forced to participate in abortion by either paying for it or participating. That consensus is unraveling. Secretary Clinton says we all ought to pay for abortion, and the governor of California says Catholic hospitals and institutions ought to have to provide them. So that's where how much energy is going into that instead of the minimum wage? The other thing is poverty. I'm an admirer of President Obama in lots of ways, but a decision was made very early on that he wasn't going to talk about poverty, that a black president couldn't talk about poverty. This you can't see, but probably. This is a chart on how much our presidents talk about the poor and the middle class. Democrats, Republicans, great focus on the poor. Barack Obama, great focus on the middle class. I have said before, I think we're homeless. I feel very homeless today. Not everybody does, I understand that. But I've worked with the homeless, and when you're homeless, you try and get out of the rain. You try and find a shelter. You build a place to be a home, and that's what we have to do. We can't just sit on the sidelines wringing our hands saying how virtuous we are, how self-righteous we are, condemning others for not believing what we believe. We need to stand up for what we believe, and we need to find places where we can encourage each other to build the common ground for the common good, to stand up for life and dignity from the very beginning to the very end. They won't be very big places at first, in both political parties, in the labor movement, in the academic community, in our churches, in our professions. But let's start coming together. I think this is what Catholic Common Ground is really about. There are lots of things we can do to stand up. Our universities need to do it. Our religious communities need to do it. Our parishes need to do it. We ought to be a home for people who share this vision and encourage people. We should not become cynical or self-righteous. We should not sit on the sidelines. This requires more engagement, not less. I remember my daughter Kelly came out of church one Sunday, and very proud of her, something of an activist. She was at a talk that Sister Helen gave and started writing someone on death row. Became a big part of who she is. And she said, you know, Dad, I don't like the choices. I said, oh, this is my daughter. She said, when I get out of college, I think I'm going to run for Congress. I thought, this is great. And her mother had a somewhat different view. She said, maybe you ought to register to vote first. Respect for human life and dignity. Solidarity. We're all in this together. That's the only way we will overcome this hate, this horror. And so I say, at a time of great trial for our country, important choices for our nation, and great opportunity for our church, the work that Common Ground does, the work that each of you do, the work that all of us have to do to build up the common ground for the common good is more important than ever. Thank you.